It was a quiet night, too quiet. Then I heard my back door creak open. My instincts, honed from years as a cop, kicked in. I grabbed my shotgun and moved through the house. And there she was, Karen, the HOA president, breaking into my home. What she didn't know, the regret she'd feel would be instant and intense. Stick around to see how this escalated and why it turned into a nightmare for her. Before we dive into the story, I've got to ask, where are you watching from? Drop your city's name in the comments below. I'm always curious about where my videos are reaching. And while you're at it, don't forget to subscribe so you can stay updated on all my upcoming stories. Now, let's get into it. It started on an ordinary evening. I had just finished a long day and was relaxing in my living room, winding down. I had no idea that just hours later my life and my home would be turned upside down. I'd been a former cop for over 10 years, and in that time, I had seen everything. But nothing could prepare me for what was about to happen. You see, Karen, the HOA president of our neighborhood, had been a thorn in my side for months. She thought she had all the power, always trying to enforce her rules with a level of arrogance that rubbed everyone the wrong way. But I never thought it would escalate to this. Breaking into my home, trying to steal my shotgun, that was a step too far. I've always prided myself on being prepared. As a former cop, I had trained myself for situations like this, but when I saw her there in my house, it wasn't just about self-defense, it was about justice. But Karen didn't know that what she was about to do would be a huge mistake. It was just after 11 p.m. when I heard it, the unmistakable creak of my back door opening. The sound was faint, but it was enough to send a chill down my spine. In the middle of the night, no one should be in my house. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the house settling. This was something far more serious. I froze. Every muscle in my body went rigid as my mind raced through 1,000 possible scenarios. A break-in? An intruder? The questions were flooding in, but they didn't do me any good. I knew I had to act fast. Years of training as a cop had prepared me for moments like this. In the past, I'd dealt with robberies, break-ins, and all sorts of dangerous situations, but this felt different. This wasn't just another random criminal. My gut told me that whoever was in my house knew exactly what they were doing. They had a purpose. I stood up quickly, my heart pounding in my chest. The house had been my sanctuary for years, a safe place to rest, away from the chaos of my job. But tonight, that peace was shattered. As I moved silently through the dark hallway, the adrenaline kicked in. Every instinct I had sharpened, my mind was on high alert. The floor creaked beneath my feet, but I didn't care. I was already in survival mode. The darkness in the house was almost suffocating, but I knew every inch of my home, every door and window. It was a tactical advantage. I made my way toward the back door, eyes scanning the shadows. I didn't turn on the lights. There was no reason to alert the intruder. But as I approached the door, my senses heightened. I could hear faint rustling sounds, the soft scrape of something metal. My breath slowed, and my pulse quickened. Someone was in here, and they weren't supposed to be. The garage door was cracked open, just enough to let me catch a glimpse of movement. Through the narrow gap, I saw a shadow, a figure in my home. I gripped my shotgun tighter, the cold metal reassuring in my hands. My training kicked in. I wasn't just holding a weapon, I was controlling the situation. I had the power now. I pushed the door open just a few inches, my body moving with practiced stealth. I could feel the tension building in my chest, the weight of the moment pressing down on me. Then I saw her, Karen. She was rifling through my garage, her hands grabbing at the shelf where I kept my shotgun. It took a moment for the full impact of what I was seeing to register. This wasn't just a random break-in. Karen, the HOA president of our neighborhood, a woman who had always been a thorn in my side, was in my garage looking for my shotgun. My mind was racing, but I knew what I had to do. The words tumbled out of me before I could stop them. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I demanded, my voice sharp, cutting through the tense silence like a knife. Anger surged through me, mixing with disbelief. Was she seriously standing there in my garage, trying to steal my shotgun? She froze, her eyes wide, clearly startled, her body stiffening at the sound of my voice. It was like time slowed down for a moment as I watched her. The shock on her face was clear. She hadn't expected me to be home. She hadn't thought anyone would catch her in the act. For a second, neither of us moved. And then, almost imperceptibly, Karen began to turn, her eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal. The defiance in her posture was palpable. She wasn't just some scared thief caught red-handed. No, she was trying to maintain control of the situation. But there was no escaping now. I was just, I thought I heard something, she stammered, her voice unconvincing. She looked anywhere, but at me. I could see the panic in her eyes, but she was trying to cover it up. It was a weak excuse, and we both knew it. There was no way I was buying it. Stop, I said coldly, stepping closer. You're trespassing, Karen. You're not welcome here. My voice was firm, laced with anger and disbelief. She had crossed a line. This wasn't just an HOA complaint or another petty argument over neighborhood rules. This was a crime, and I wasn't about to let her get away with it. Her eyes flicked around the garage, as though she were searching for an escape. She was trapped in the corner, and she knew it. The look in her eyes shifted, and I could see her trying to calculate her next move. But there was no out, no way to talk her way out of this one. She had made a serious mistake, and I wasn't going to let her get away with it. Karen had always thought she could push people around, using her position as the HOA president to get what she wanted. She'd made it her mission to control the neighborhood, nitpicking every detail of people's lives. But this was different. She had come into my home, tried to steal my property. She had no idea who she was messing with. Karen, do you really think you can just break into someone's house and take what you want? I asked, my voice laced with disgust. You're not some authority here. You've got no power in my home. I was done with her. Done with her control, her arrogance. She had gone too far, and now she was going to face the consequences of her actions. I could see her weighing her options. She was calculating, trying to figure out if she could run, if she could talk her way out of this. But there was no negotiation here. She wasn't going anywhere until the police arrived. Listen, Karen, I said, keeping my voice steady cold, you've got two choices. You can wait for the police, or we can take this further, but either way, this is over. She took a step back, her eyes darting between me and the door, as if she was trying to figure out if she could make a break for it. But I could see the panic set in as she realized that escape wasn't an option. Her eyes locked onto mine, and in that moment, I saw it, the realization of the gravity of the situation. The regret was already starting to set in. But it was too late. I stood there, shotgun in hand, and watched Karen. The audacity of this woman, it was almost beyond belief. She was someone who had made it her mission to dictate everyone else's life in the neighborhood, to impose rules, enforce her authority, and make everyone feel small. And here she was, standing in my home, rummaging through my garage, trying to steal my shotgun. This wasn't just a break-in, this was personal. I had dealt with her on countless occasions before, but I never imagined it would come to this. She had been the HOA president for too long, self-appointed in her mind, and had taken it upon herself to become the unofficial judge of everything in the neighborhood. Whether it was someone's lawn being too unkempt or an extra chair left out on a porch, she found some way to enforce a rule, whether it made sense or not. She had harassed my neighbors over the smallest of infractions, pushing people to comply with petty regulations that seemed to have no real benefit. She enjoyed the control, the feeling of power that came with holding a position where she could dictate who did what and when. But all of it felt small, almost laughable until this moment. Until she broke into my house. Karen had been a constant thorn in everyone's side, but I had always kept my distance. I had spoken to my neighbors about her once or twice, exchanged frustrated words over coffee, but I never got deeply involved. I had no desire to participate in the HOA drama. It wasn't worth the energy. Besides, I thought I knew how to navigate people like Karen. I thought I understood the game she was playing, and I was content to stay on the sidelines. But tonight, I had underestimated her. My mind raced as I processed everything that had just happened. She wasn't just a meddling neighbor anymore. She was a criminal. She had crossed a line by coming into my home with no invitation, no reason, only her own twisted need to assert control. To what end? What did she think she was going to accomplish by stealing my shotgun? I could see her now, her hands twitching, her eyes darting back and forth as she mentally calculated her next move. She was trapped. There was no escape, no way out. I was a former cop. I knew how to handle situations like this, and she had made the grave mistake of thinking she could overpower me. But Karen's ability to manipulate and control everyone around her would no longer work. Not here. Not now. You're not going anywhere until the cops get here, Karen, I said, keeping my voice even but firm. You can explain yourself to them. Her eyes flashed with panic. I could see the initial disbelief on her face, as if she had never considered the possibility of facing real consequences. Her arrogance, the same arrogance that had gotten her this far in life, was starting to slip away. You don't understand, she stammered, her voice rising with desperation. I wasn't going to steal it. I just needed to, borrow it for a bit. There's a situation with the neighborhood, and I cut her off with a sharp motion of my hand. I wasn't about to let her spin this into some half-baked excuse. Stop lying, I said, my voice cold, unwavering. You were here to steal it. No one breaks into someone's house at this hour just to borrow a shotgun. You had a plan, Karen, and it didn't involve borrowing anything. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. I could hear her breathing, shallow and panicked, but she couldn't find a way to dig herself out of the hole she'd just dug. And that was when I saw it, the change in her expression. The reality of her situation had finally dawned on her. She had crossed a line that she couldn't erase. Karen, who had spent her whole life playing people, using her position of power to manipulate and control, had finally met someone who wasn't going to let her get away with it. The regret settled in, slow at first, creeping across her face. Her shoulders slumped slightly, and her eyes started to shift uneasily, as if she could suddenly see the consequences of her actions playing out in front of her. But it was too late for apologies, too late for excuses. I could see it in her eyes, the realization that her plans had crumbled. There was no way to talk her way out of this, no way to spin the situation in her favor. I didn't mean to. She started, her voice trailing off. But her words were hollow. It was too little, too late. I took a step closer, my gaze fixed firmly on hers. It's over, Karen. You broke into my home, you tried to steal from me. You made a mistake. Now you'll face the consequences. The panic in her eyes deepened as she started to pace, her mind clearly racing for a way out. I could tell she was calculating, trying to figure out if she could somehow flee or convince me to let her go. But no amount of pleading was going to change the facts. She was a criminal, and I wasn't about to let her go without facing the law. You've crossed the line, I continued, my voice unwavering. I don't care what you think you were doing. You had no right to be here. You thought you could walk into my house, steal my property, and just walk out? Not happening. Her hands trembled as she reached for the door handle, clearly desperate to make an escape, but I was right there, blocking her path. She was cornered, and she knew it, but the more she struggled, the more I could see the cracks forming in her facade. Karen had always prided herself on being the one in control, on being the person who called the shots. But now, she was no different from any other intruder. She had overplayed her hand, and in doing so, she had lost everything. Please, she said, her voice trembling now, her bravado gone. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I just thought. She looked down, unable to meet my eyes, the weight of her failure too much to bear. She was broken, at least for the moment, but that wasn't going to change what had happened. I stood there, unmoving, my grip on the shotgun tight. She wasn't going anywhere. The only thing left to do, now, was wait for the police. Her true intentions had been laid bare, and they weren't, as innocent as she had hoped to convince me. Karen's reign of terror, her belief that she could control everyone around her, had ended. This time, she had pushed too far, and there was no way out for her. She had made her bed, and now she would have to lie in it. As the minutes passed, I could see her resolve weakening. The regret was there, written clearly on her face, but it was far too late for any of that. The tension in the room was palpable, like a taut string stretched to its breaking point. Karen was standing in front of me, trapped in the corner of my garage, and I could see the panic rising in her eyes. She had always been the one who held the power, the one who could make people squirm under her gaze. But now the tables had turned. The fear in her expression told me everything. I was in control now. For the first time since I'd met her, Karen wasn't the one calling the shots. She wasn't the self-assured HOA president, the one who had made people uncomfortable with her petty demands and manipulative tactics. No, in this moment, she was just another trespasser, another person who had made the grave mistake of trying to break into my home. Her chest heaved as she tried to steady her breathing, her hands trembling. The confidence she had carried with her so effortlessly in the past had crumbled in an instant, and now she was struggling to hold onto something, anything, that would give her an escape. But there was no escape. Not anymore. I took a step closer, my grip tightening on my shotgun, the cold metal reassuring in my hands. I wasn't intimidated by her anymore. I didn't need to be. Why, Karen? I asked, my voice low but filled with cold fury. Why would you come here to my home and do something like this? She shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting around the garage, like she was searching for an escape route. But there was nowhere to go. She was cornered, and we both knew it. There was no running, no easy way out of this situation. Karen opened her mouth, her words stammering out like she was trying to convince herself that everything was okay. I thought you wouldn't notice. You're just a retired cop. You don't make excuses. I cut in sharply, my voice rising with authority. You came here with the intention of stealing from me, and now you're going to pay for it. For a moment, the room was still. The only sound was the soft, shallow rhythm of her breathing. Her eyes were wide, filled with a mix of fear and disbelief. She couldn't comprehend that this wasn't just some small mistake, some harmless act. No, Karen had broken into my home, tried to steal my property, and now the consequences were about to catch up with her. The silence in the room stretched, and I could see the regret in her eyes. But it wasn't enough. It was too late for remorse. She had crossed a line that couldn't be undone. And then, in a sudden, desperate move, she lunged toward the door. I saw her muscles tense, the sudden shift in her body language telling me that she was going for broke. She was going to try to run, to escape. But I was faster. I reacted without thinking, my body moving on instinct honed from years of training. With a quick, fluid motion, I stepped in front of her, blocking her path to the door. She stumbled back, her face a mix of shock and panic, as if she had thought she could just slip past me and vanish into the night. But she was wrong. She had underestimated me, and now she was going to pay for it. I reached out, grabbing her arm with a firm grip, preventing her from going any further. She struggled against me, her hands pushing at my chest, but it was no use. I was stronger, more prepared. There was no escape for her. You're not going anywhere, I said, my voice cold and unwavering, full of authority. You're going to wait right here until the cops arrive? Her eyes widened with desperation, her pulse racing in her throat. She was trapped, physically and mentally. She had no idea how to get out of this, and I could see the panic rising in her as she tried to pull away from my grasp. I didn't budge. I held her in place, my grip unyielding until she stopped struggling. It wasn't that I wanted to hurt her, but I wasn't about to let her go. Not after what she'd done. You've made a huge mistake, I said, my voice steady, my grip tightening just enough for her to know that I meant business. You thought you could just walk into my home, steal from me, and leave without consequence? Well, that's not how this works. Karen's face was pale, her breath shallow as she tried to regain some semblance of control over the situation. She was desperate now, her mind racing for an explanation, for some way to wriggle out of this, but I could see the defeat in her eyes. She knew it was over. "I didn't mean it," she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. I thought I could handle things. I didn't think you'd even notice." Her words were pathetic, a hollow attempt to justify the unjustifiable. I could see the wheels turning in her head, but the reality of the situation was setting in. She had broken into my home. She had tried to take something from me, and now there was no way out for her. "You thought wrong," I replied, my voice flat. "You don't get to just walk in here and take what doesn't belong to you. This is a crime, Karen, and you're going to pay for it." I could feel her shoulders slump in defeat, the fight leaving her. She stopped struggling against my grip, her hands falling limply at her sides. For a moment, she just stood there, looking at the ground, unable to meet my eyes. I wasn't sure if she was ashamed, or if she was just too tired to keep up the charade. Either way, it didn't matter anymore. I wasn't going to let her off the hook. I wasn't going to let her talk her way out of this. She had violated my space. She had tried to steal from me, and she wasn't leaving until the police arrived. But as I held her there, I could see the realization on her face. The sense of control she had once wielded with such confidence was gone, replaced by something far more terrifying for her. The knowledge that her actions had consequences, and she was finally going to have to face them. The silence between us stretched, and I could hear the faint sound of sirens approaching in the distance. The police were on their way, and the moment of reckoning was near. Karen knew it, too. She could feel the weight of her mistake pressing down on her, and it was inescapable. She had crossed a line, and now the consequences of her actions were about to catch up with her. By the time the police arrived, Karen had stopped struggling. She was no longer trying to escape, no longer pleading or making excuses. There was nothing left to say, no way to twist the situation in her favor. Her shoulders slumped, and I could see the weight of what she had done finally hit her. There was no power left in her. She was just a woman caught in the consequences of her own actions. She had come into my home with the intention of taking what wasn't hers, a weapon, a shotgun that had been in my family for years. She thought that, by stealing it, she could gain some sort of control. Maybe she thought she could use it as a bargaining chip, or maybe she was just trying to assert her dominance. Whatever the reason, her plan had failed. She had underestimated the one thing that would break her, accountability. As the sirens grew louder, Karen remained silent, her head hanging low. She stood there, motionless, her once confident demeanor shattered beyond repair. I couldn't help but feel a little satisfaction in seeing her like this. She had spent months, maybe even years, manipulating everyone in the neighborhood, using her position as the HOA president to impose her will. And now it was over. She had no more control, no more power. When the police finally arrived, they wasted no time. The officers took over, moving swiftly and decisively. One officer approached Karen, speaking in a calm but firm tone. "Ma'am, you're under arrest for breaking and entering and attempting to steal a firearm. Please turn around and place your hands behind your back." Karen didn't resist. There was no defiance in her eyes, no argument. She simply obeyed, her movements slow and resigned. The cuffs clicked shut around her wrists with a sound that was far too satisfying. For a moment, I just watched. I didn't feel anger or rage. I felt a quiet sense of justice. She had tried to steal from me, tried to break into my life, and now she was going to face the consequences. I stepped back as the officers led her out of the garage and toward the patrol car. She didn't speak a word. Her face was pale, her expression vacant. The woman who had once walked into every room with an air of superiority and control was now nothing more than a subdued, defeated figure. I couldn't help but reflect on what this meant, not just for Karen, but for the entire neighborhood. Karen's reign as HOA president had been a long one, and it had left a lot of people feeling powerless. Her rules had been strict, often unreasonable, and she had used her position to intimidate others into compliance. People had whispered about her behind closed doors, had resented her control, but no one had ever had the courage to stand up to her, not until now. Karen had tried to manipulate and control the people around her, but now it was clear that no one, myself included, was going to let her get away with it. The damage she had caused was far-reaching, and while she would face the legal consequences of her actions, the emotional toll on the neighborhood had been just as severe. The fear and discomfort she had instilled in others would take time to undo, but it was clear now that people would no longer cower in fear of her. They would no longer tolerate her abuse of power. As the officers drove away with Karen, I stood there for a moment, watching them disappear into the night. It was over. The neighborhood could finally breathe again. The days that followed felt like a strange mix of relief and disbelief. Karen's arrest became the talk of the neighborhood. People who had been too afraid to speak out against her for years now felt emboldened. The sense of fear that had lingered in the air was slowly dissipating, replaced by a new sense of freedom. People were no longer afraid of her. The man who had always been just the retired cop in the neighborhood now found himself at the center of it all. It wasn't that I wanted the spotlight, it was that I had been forced into it by Karen's actions. She had pushed us all to this point. In the weeks that followed, Karen's name became synonymous with abuse of power, and her position as HOA president was swiftly revoked. The board members who had once followed her lead now distanced themselves from her, realizing that they had been complicit in her reign of terror. The community began to heal, and while it would take time to restore the peace that Karen had so carelessly destroyed, there was hope. People started talking to each other again. Neighbors who had once kept to themselves now gathered on their porches, chatting and laughing, no longer fearful of a knock on their door from Karen demanding they fix something that didn't need fixing. The oppressive weight of her influence had been lifted. As for me, life slowly returned to a new kind of normal. I no longer had to worry about Karen popping up at my door unannounced or making life difficult for me and my neighbors. I still kept to myself, as I always had, but there was a sense of peace that hadn't been there before. The anxiety, the constant looking over my shoulder, had vanished. Karen was no longer a threat, and for the first time in a long while, I could truly relax in my own home. Of course, the legal process would take time. There would be hearings, a trial, and eventually, Karen would have to face the music. But for now, I allowed myself a moment to reflect on how far things had come. She had tried to steal from me, and now she was going to pay for it. But more importantly, Karen had lost something much bigger than a position of power. She had lost the ability to manipulate and control people's lives. She had underestimated the one thing that had always kept me on my toes, the ability to fight back. The consequences of Karen's actions were far-reaching, not just in terms of her arrest, but in how it affected the neighborhood as a whole. She had ruled with an iron fist for so long that people had become afraid to speak out against her, to challenge her decisions. But when someone finally stood up to her, when I finally stood up to her, it was as if a weight had been lifted from everyone's shoulders. No one was going to be intimidated by her anymore. Her arrest was just the beginning of the changes to come. The HOA would have new leadership, people who actually cared about the community and its residents, not about enforcing petty rules for the sake of control. The old board members were replaced, and for the first time in years, the neighborhood felt like a place of camaraderie, not fear. Karen's fall from grace was swift and severe. The things she had done, the lives she had affected, could not be erased overnight. But at least now there was a chance for healing, for people to reclaim their sense of self, their dignity, and their peace. As Karen was taken away in handcuffs, it wasn't just about her getting what she deserved. It was about everyone else, the people who had been oppressed by her tyranny, finally getting the justice they deserved. And for the first time in a long time, we all had hope. Hope that the future would be different. Hope that we could finally live without fear. The aftermath of that night was swift and widespread. The moment Karen was led away in handcuffs, the heavy tension that had hung over the neighborhood for so long seemed to dissolve into the air. The news of her arrest spread quickly through the community like wildfire. In a matter of hours, it seemed everyone knew what had happened. The story was the talk of every street corner, every front porch, and every backyard. People who had quietly suffered under Karen's control for so long, who had been too intimidated to speak up, too fearful to challenge her, finally felt a sense of relief. No longer would they have to endure her endless fines for trivial matters, or her constant surveillance of their properties, or the way she would barge into their lives, demanding that they conform to her rigid standards. It was over. The woman who had terrorized us all with her sense of power and entitlement was finally gone. But while the neighborhood breathed a collective sigh of relief, I was left with a strange sense of closure mixed with something else, a feeling I couldn't quite place. There was no celebration, no sense of triumph on my part. After all, this wasn't a situation I had ever envisioned dealing with in my life. I had spent years as a cop handling violent crime, robberies, and assaults. I dealt with the worst of the worst in my career, but nothing prepared me for this. Facing off against a manipulative woman, once thought to be above the law, who tried to steal from me in the dead of night. This was not the kind of case I'd imagined when I hung up my badge, and it wasn't something I could easily forget. As I sat in the quiet of my home the night after Karen's arrest, I couldn't help but replay the events over and over again in my mind. How had it come to this? How had someone like her, someone with so much power over people's everyday lives, lost all sense of morality? Karen wasn't just a petty HOA president. She wasn't just a bureaucratic bully. She was someone who had allowed her need to control others to consume her, to the point where she felt entitled to break into my home and steal from me. But the more I thought about it, the clearer it became. Karen was driven by something deeper than just a need for power. It wasn't simply about enforcing rules or being the authority figure in the neighborhood. It was about control, total, absolute control. Her sense of entitlement had become so extreme that it clouded her judgment. She couldn't see how far she had crossed the line because she thought she had a right to do whatever she wanted. For her, rules applied to everyone else, but not to her. She believed her position as the HOA president made her untouchable above reproach. But in the end, it was that very sense of superiority that led to her downfall. As the days passed after the incident, the atmosphere in the neighborhood felt different. People were more relaxed. Conversations were lighter. The air seemed to be filled with a new sense of freedom. Neighbors who had been living in fear of Karen's threats now felt like they could finally breathe again. The constant pressure, the suffocating environment she had created, was gone. No one was looking over their shoulders, waiting for a visit from her demanding they fix something trivial or pay a fine for a non-existent infraction. The HOA meetings, once tense and uncomfortable, were now filled with laughter and camaraderie. People who had been silenced by Karen's power were finally able to speak up, to voice their concerns without fear of reprisal. It was as though a weight had been lifted from the neighborhood. Everyone seemed lighter, freer. But amidst all the relief, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right. The entire situation had been too surreal, too jarring. It wasn't just Karen's actions that troubled me, it was the realization that she wasn't an isolated case. Karen had taken advantage of a system that allowed people like her to exert their power over others with no accountability. She had become intoxicated by her own sense of control, and as she continued to assert herself in the neighborhood, she had convinced herself that she could get away with anything. She was a product of the unchecked power that the HOA provided, and that realization weighed heavily on me. I began to think about the neighborhood and how easily it could happen again. Karen had been a person who thrived on control, on putting others in their place. But she wasn't the only one capable of crossing that line. There were other people out there, people who could just as easily slip into a position of power and do the same thing. The neighborhood had learned a valuable lesson, but it wasn't over. The damage Karen had done, the fear she had instilled, couldn't be undone overnight. And yet, in the midst of all this, something else became clear. The community had been resilient. The people here had withstood years of Karen's tyranny, and now that she was gone, they were finding their voices again. I couldn't help but feel a sense of pride for the people I had come to know, even if it had taken something as drastic as Karen's arrest to bring that out. People were taking control of their own lives again. They weren't afraid anymore. They were standing up for each other. I still remember one of my neighbors, Mrs. Hargrave, a woman in her 70s who had been terrified of Karen for years. Every time Karen showed up at her door with a complaint about her garden or the color of her mailbox, Mrs. Hargrave would shrink back in fear, apologizing profusely, even though she had done nothing wrong. After Karen's arrest, Mrs. Hargrave came over to my house one afternoon, holding a small plant in her hand. "I've been meaning to give you this," she said, her voice steady but soft, "for everything you did. You've done what none of us had the courage to do. I don't know where we'd be without you." It wasn't much, a small gesture, but to me it meant everything. The community had turned a corner. People were realizing that they didn't have to live in fear. They could stand up for themselves. And more importantly, they were doing it together. As the days turned into weeks, I started to feel the full weight of what had happened. Karen's arrest had brought an end to her reign, but it had also revealed something much more profound: the power of community. When people come together, when they refuse to tolerate abuse and manipulation, they can change the course of their lives. Karen had been a powerful force for far too long, but now she was just a cautionary tale, a reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of standing up to injustice. I would never forget that night. It was a reminder that no one is above the law, no matter how high they climb or how much power they hold. It was also a reminder that sometimes the biggest battles aren't the ones we fight on the outside. They're the ones we fight within ourselves. The fight for justice, the fight for what's right, takes courage. But when you stand together, there's nothing you can't overcome. And in the end, I realized that despite all the chaos Karen had caused, this community had emerged stronger, and so had I. In the weeks that followed, life slowly returned to a kind of normalcy. The chaotic energy of Karen's arrest, the tension in the air, and the weeks of uncertainty all began to fade into the background as the neighborhood regained a sense of peace. It was as if the cloud that had been hanging over us for so long was finally gone, replaced by a fresh, clear sky. People were walking with a little more confidence, chatting with their neighbors again without the fear of a HOA inspection or an unannounced visit from Karen. For me, though, the return to normal wasn't as simple. Karen was gone, yes, but the impact of her actions lingered. It wasn't just the fear of her breaking into my home, it was the realization of how easily someone can abuse power, how quickly they can turn from a respected authority figure to someone who becomes a threat. The experience had shaken me, not just because of the immediate danger she posed, but because it had forced me to confront how unprepared we all were for someone like her, someone who lived among us with the ability to manipulate, control, and in the worst case, cross lines we never expected. I had always prided myself on being a vigilant person. A former cop, someone who knew how to assess a situation, to make decisions quickly, to think ahead. But this situation had caught me off guard. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that the danger wasn't just in the unexpected break-ins or violent crimes we often train for. It was in the people who slipped through the cracks, the people who blended in with the crowd, wearing masks of respectability and authority. Karen had used her position in the HOA as a shield, a means to exert control over others. And that made me wonder how many more people were out there who, like her, could twist their power into something dangerous, something toxic. I spent days thinking about this. I couldn't shake the thought that the neighborhood's peace was only temporary, that the kind of abuse Karen had inflicted could happen again. People like Karen, people who thrive on power, who feed off the vulnerability of others, don't just disappear. They're often found in places of influence, in positions where they can manipulate the lives of those around them without anyone noticing, without anyone realizing how far their control can extend. This was the new reality I had to face. I wasn't just worried about Karen anymore. I was worried about the people like her, the ones who operate under the radar, hiding behind authority or charm, biding their time. That kind of manipulation is often the hardest to detect, and it's the kind that can cause the most harm. The thought gnawed at me. But It also made me think about the kind of world I wanted to live in, the kind of environment I wanted my neighbors to live in. We couldn't just go back to the way things were, where we turned a blind eye to the small injustices or hoped that someone else would handle it. We had all been complicit in allowing Karen to have unchecked power for so long. It was time for that to change. I realized, too, that it wasn't just Karen who had learned a lesson in all of this. I had learned something just as valuable. Despite the peace we had now, I couldn't let my guard down. No matter how prepared you think you are, life has a way of throwing curveballs. In this case, it was Karen. But next time, it could be someone else. It could be someone who looked more like us, who blended in with the crowd and carried themselves like they belonged. I began to think more seriously about what I could do to prevent something like this from happening again. Not just for me, but for everyone in the neighborhood. I knew I had the tools to defend myself, but it wasn't just about protecting myself. It was about protecting others, my neighbors, my friends, the people who might not have the experience or the resources to stand up to a figure like Karen. We had all learned a hard lesson, but that lesson could be used to build something better. So, I started talking to the people around me. The more I spoke to my neighbors, the more I realized they shared the same concerns. They were worried about more than just Karen. They were worried about the potential for more people like her, people who could take advantage of a position of power, people who could manipulate the system for their own gain. We needed to do something about it. We began organizing meetings, not just about the HOA, but about how we could make our community stronger, more united. We started discussing the idea of forming a neighborhood watch, of creating a system where we all held each other accountable, not just for crime, but for fairness, for transparency, for respect. We weren't going to let the power dynamics of a single person dictate our lives anymore. It wasn't a quick fix, and it wasn't something that happened overnight. But slowly, the momentum built. We rallied together a small group of neighbors who had had enough. We weren't going to allow someone to take advantage of us again. We began electing new leadership, people who understood that power should come with responsibility, not control. And we began to see the fruits of our labor. There were fewer complaints. People felt safer, more secure in their own homes. And most importantly, they felt heard. They felt like they mattered. Karen's arrest and everything that followed didn't just change the dynamics of the neighborhood, it changed me. I had spent my career working for law and order, but now I understood the importance of community and vigilance in a way I never had before. It wasn't just about law enforcement. It was about us, the people, taking responsibility for each other and ensuring that those in positions of power never again had the ability to exploit that power for their own gain. The lesson I learned from Karen wasn't just about the danger of a criminal. It was about the dangers of complacency. It was about realizing that no matter how peaceful things might seem, there's always a risk of someone taking advantage of others. We had a duty to be vigilant, to protect each other, to speak out against unfairness and abuse, no matter how small it might seem. And so, the community grew stronger. We learned how to work together, how to stand up for what was right, and how to make sure that we were always prepared, not just for the obvious threats, but for the quiet, insidious ones that can slip through the cracks if we're not careful. Looking back, I realized that Karen didn't just break into my home. She broke open something much deeper. She exposed the vulnerabilities in our community, the places where people could fall through the cracks. But in doing so, she also forced us to come together and build something stronger, something that would stand the test of time. So, while Karen might have thought she was going to steal a weapon from me that night, she ended up giving me something far more valuable, a lesson in resilience, in vigilance, and in the power of community. And for that, I would always be grateful. If you were as shocked by this story as I was, hit that like button and share your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have done in my shoes? And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next intense story. Drop the name of your city in the comments. I'd love to know where my videos are reaching. Remember, always stay vigilant, stay prepared, and never let anyone take advantage of you. You never know when someone might cross a line. Until next time, stay safe and keep watching.